It's the 19th century. Britain and Russia view each other with immense suspicion. Britain fears Russia, which is expanding ruthlessly, is coming for its prized possession, India. And Russia, which has no intention of the sort, fears Britain, which is interfering with their influence in Central Asia. This mutual distrust between two of the most powerful countries on earth would spark a Cold War. Spies from both parties raced through the mountains and deserts of the region, and both armies fought proxy wars across the little kingdoms that stood in their way. Afghanistan and its neighbors, quiet and peaceful, would become a battlefield. This is the story of that Cold War. This is the Great Game. India. Great rulers throughout the centuries have set their sights on India, desiring her endless riches and resources. Russia was no exception to this. Peter and Catherine the Great had toyed with the concept, but ultimately realized it would be folly to try and invade British India. They simply didn't have the resources or the will to risk war with the most powerful empire on earth over the jewel in the crown. That was until Paul I came along. Paul had planned a spectacular invasion of India by assembling a party of 35,000 Cossacks. In a letter to Napoleon, he proposed this wild plan. He would send his party of 35,000 Cossacks down south, gathering strength along the way by recruiting the local tribesmen. At the same time, the French would lead a similarly sized army across the Danube, Don and Volga rivers. Both sides would meet in Persia, and from there they would launch a massive assault against India. It occurred to Napoleon that this was an aging and delusional ruler, and he rejected the frivolous plan. Before taking the much wiser and more sensible decision of going on to invade Russia, Paul, who knew nothing about the terrain between his domain and India, regardless, had no intention of abandoning his harebrained scheme, and decided to go it alone. In 1801, his Cossacks left for India. The march through Turkestan would prove to be unimaginably difficult, even for the war-hardened Cossacks. They began to suffer in the bitter cold of the Kyrgyz steppe, and their food supplies began to dwindle. But, as luck would have it, the maniacal ruler Paul would be assassinated, and his sensible son Alexander called off the invasion. The Cossacks, or at least the half that survived, returned to Orenburg. After getting wind of the scheme, the British naturally began to get apprehensive. At this point, Russia had thoroughly overpowered Napoleon and was beginning to throw its weight on the world stage. At the Congress of Vienna, Tsar Alexander had brashly demanded the entirety of Poland. In Asia too, the two-headed eagle was beginning to gather immense strength. And if they were to set their sights on India again, this time they might succeed. This prospect terrified the British, and several British journalists known as hawks began writing books sensationalizing the Russian threat, overplaying Russia's dominance in the Caucasus and Anatolia. In the eyes of these Russophobes, an invasion of India was imminent. It was just a matter of when. In 1828, Russia comprehensively defeated Persia and forced the Shah to sign humiliating concessions. To the British, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Russia had reduced the mighty Persia to a vassal state and was now knocking on the door of British India. The British after this kicked into second gear. Lord Wade organized a complex network of spies and informants in the bazaars and shops of the cities. Lord Ellenborough began training a new cadre of political officers to engage in daring expeditions across the mountains and deserts of Central Asia. And a young Scottish officer called Alexander Burnes is sent on a mission to Lahore to map the Indus River under the pretext of giving gifts to the Sikh ruler Ranjit Singh. The actions of these men would irrevocably shape the history of Central Asia. The British strategy to protect India was to insulate it with a series of buffer states. They wanted to befriend all the tribal rulers on their borders. So if the Russians came knocking, they would first have to contend with Britain's allies. This would naturally make it harder for the Russians to stroll into India as they pleased. So the mission was to make friends with the two main potent forces on Britain's borders, the Sikhs, ruled by Ranjit Singh, and the Afghans, ruled by Dost Muhammad Khan. Burns' mission to befriend Ranjit Singh, as mentioned earlier, succeeded with flying colours, and he followed that up with a near-suicidal mission to Kabul and then on to Bukhara. These were lands unseen by European eyes, places where non-Muslims were viewed with immense suspicion. Yet Burns, a master of the local languages and etiquette, succeeded in this as well. He made close friends with the Emir of Afghanistan and the Afghan people, and after that established contact with the Emirate of Bukhara. When he returned to Britain, his book became an overnight bestseller and he was made an instant celebrity. However, in doing so, he had made himself some powerful enemies. While Burns had enjoyed a meteoric rise in the East India Company, senior officers like Wade and Ellenborough disapproved of his unorthodox route to fortune and fame. They were part of an establishment and had spent years building careers for themselves in the company ranks by poring over books and maps, not by actually visiting the places that they studied. And when they saw a young misfit from Scotland quickly be promoted by doing that, they felt threatened and jealous. And it would not be long before they were at loggerheads, for there was one slight problem in the British plan, the province of Peshawar. The Afghans and Sikhs had long been sworn enemies, and Peshawar, rich and fertile, was at the heart of their constant battles and struggles. In 1830, Ranjit Singh captured Peshawar, which had long been part of Afghanistan. Dost Muhammad had made it a key promise to his people that Peshawar would be retaken, and thus refused to ally himself with his enemy Ranjit Singh. This, of course, posed a problem: how to reconcile the two. Burns had a quick and easy solution: just broker a peace agreement between the two. The Sikhs were having problems holding on to Peshawar anyway, so they would likely be open to a compromise benefiting both sides. But those in higher places were blind to this. Wade and Ellenborough had planned something radically different. They wanted to overthrow the ruler of Afghanistan and replace him with his rival. And when Burns was away in the mountains, they went to the Foreign Secretary, Lord Auckland, and fabricated all sorts of flaws in Burns' sensible policy, convincing him to abandon it. And somehow, it worked. The British had decided to forcibly remove the strong-willed ruler of Afghanistan when they were looking for a strong ruler to oppose the Russians. And things would get much worse, for Burns would meet a rival in Kabul. On Christmas Eve 1837, Captain Ivan Vitkevich rode into Kabul, bearing gifts from the Tsar and wishing to speak with Dost Muhammad. And when one looked at his life before becoming a diplomat, one could not help but feel inspired. Born as young Prosper Vitkevich in Lithuania, he was arrested at the tender age of 14 for planning anti-Russian activities, and he was exiled into Central Asia, separated from the rest of his family forever. There, he chose not to throw in the towel and instead obsessed himself with learning the culture, languages, and politics of the region, trying to rebuild his life as a diplomat. And one could say he had succeeded, as he entered Kabul bearing gifts from the Tsar, wishing to speak with Dost Muhammad. His mission was to ally with the Afghan ruler, for the Russians themselves were beginning to fear British officers like Burns dallying on their borders. At this point, Dost Muhammad was playing the great game just as well as any British or Russian spy. Now that both British and Russian offers of alliance were on the table, he was weighing his options, assessing which was the more valuable ally. But the British made a grievous miscalculation. They saw even speaking to the Russians as a betrayal from the Emir, and at once sent a crucial and harsh ultimatum to sever all ties with Russia. The ultimatum treated the Emir of Afghanistan almost like he was a petulant child, demanding that he sever all ties with the Russians and humiliatingly beg Ranjit Singh for forgiveness, his bitter enemy. Burns, distraught that his work to forge a British alliance had failed, found it incredibly tough to even read the letter aloud to his good friend. At this point, Dost Muhammad's fate was sealed. Realizing he did not factor in British plans for Afghanistan, he threw in his lot with the Russians. The Russians had claimed a decisive victory in the Great Game. However, while Russia had orchestrated a diplomatic masterclass in Afghanistan, their advances in Persia had been thwarted by British brilliance. After wresting control of the Shah squad, the Russian agent Count Simonich urged the ruler to besiege Herat. offering lucrative Russian gold as a reward. Unable to refuse, the Shah began amassing troops near the western city. It seemed like Russia was going to take a decisive step towards India by taking over Herat. And soon, one of the most legendary battles in Great Game history would commence. Unbeknownst to any of the invaders, a British officer named Eldred Pottinger had arrived in the city, and he immediately began organizing its defenses. He was to be sorely needed, for the invaders had a European general in their midst who could outmaneuver the defenders' less advanced siege tactics. On November the 23rd, the siege began, and for 9 months it would be an absolute slog, punctuated with barbaric scenes. The Herati commander Yar Mohammed, who was vizier to the drunken and ineffective ruler Kamran Shah, he often encouraged his troops to cut off the enemy heads and place them along the ramparts to sicken the onrushing Persians. The Persians similarly committed gruesome atrocities upon those unfortunate enough to fall into their hands. But just as things began getting desperate for both sides, with food, fuel, and ammunition dangerously low, Count Simonich bravely went to the front line and himself began commanding the nominally Persian forces. And on June the 24th, 1838, he launched his great attack, his master plan. The Persians launched an obscene barrage of artillery from every corner of the city. And after that, the Heratis were forced to contend with the fierce charge of Persians from 5 different points at the same time. And at one of those points, the Persians won. The Heratis were hanging on by a mere thread. Yar Mohammed and Pottinger rushed to the scene. The vizier, who had never before been called a coward by anyone, seeing how close the Persians were to breaking open his beloved city, he slumped to the ground, and for a moment it looked like Herat had fallen. But Pottinger was not having it. Revitalized by a new wave of energy, he stood up, dragged Yar Mohammed, his commander, by the arm, and he reviled him to do something for the city. The vizier then charged at his own troops like a madman, urging them to fight. Fearing their ruler more than the enemy themselves, the troops were forced to fight, and the city was saved. And soon the British sent warships to the other side of Persia, threatening war, giving the Shah enough of a scare to back down. The British had won, and the Russians had been thoroughly embarrassed. Count Simonich was immediately recalled to St. Petersburg, and he was disgraced, having failed to deliver Herat to the Tsar. Count Witkevich, however, made a far more tragic fate. After he came back from Kabul, he was celebrated as a hero by the Russians, and even garnered great praise for winning over Afghanistan. However, rumor has it that later he met with an old friend from Lithuania, who admonished him for betraying his homeland and being a traitor to the Russians. After all, he who opposed the Russian oppression in Lithuania as a child, he was now doing their dirty work. Filled with remorse and guilt, he took his pistol and blew his brains out. The tragic end to a brief but illustrious career. However, all was quickly forgotten in the tidal wave of events that shook Central Asia. While the British had succeeded in Herat, they were not going to tolerate the Russian-leaning Dost Muhammad right on their borders. They immediately made the decision to restore Shah Shuja to the throne by force. Soon Britain began mobilizing troops to quickly march in and take over Afghanistan. Leading this mission was William Haber Norton, who was in that bracket of British officers jealous of Burns and overconfident about his own knowledge of Afghanistan. These kingmakers ignored several warnings from some experienced officers and Afghan tribal chiefs about how truly difficult it was going to be to conquer Afghanistan in the long term. And before you knew it, the army of the Indus, with Shah Shuja at the helm, marched into Afghanistan with their red coats and British bayonets. The regiments marching into the emirate were clearly ill-equipped for war. Most treated it like an excursion rather than an invasion, bringing on their gilded elephants luxuries that were unfit for the battlefield. Some brigadiers had as many as 60 camels to carry their personal belongings, and this arrogant force marched through Kandahar and Ghazni into Kabul, while Dost Muhammad fled north, realizing that his allies had deserted him and devastated by the death of his son. Afghanistan was now British. However, as soon as the British entered Kabul, unbeknownst to the invaders, they had sparked a hidden anger and hostility amongst the locals. You see, the Afghans pride themselves on their independence and never like another power coming in and dictating what to do. And now that the British had extinguished their autonomy, the Afghans were seized with a new determination to fight for their country and their freedom. The British were oblivious to this change in the Afghan psyche, and in a few years, Afghanistan had been turned into an exotic destination. This attracted the wives and children of British officers to join them and permanently settle there. Thus, Afghanistan had been decked out with every luxury imaginable, from cricket to concerts. The British thought that they were all but settled in the new colony, that their grip in Central Asia would stand the test of time, that the great game was over. But the Afghans would never forgive, and they never forgot. When reports of womanizing and drinking began to reach local ears, the people of Afghanistan decided that they had had enough, and they turned on their friend Alexander Burns, who once said that he could trust the Afghans with his life. Burns had gone from being a friend of the Afghan people to a traitor. His friendly gestures were now seen as fake, and Burns was now regarded as a spy sent to surveil Afghanistan for the British invasion. And on November 1st, 1841, he was informed by his clever assistant, Mohan Lal, that someone would try to kill him that very night. But Burns, still thinking himself to be well loved by the Afghans, chose to ignore this warning, confident that he could quell any threat. However, that night, a crowd of angry Afghans assembled outside his house, and they were intent to punish Burns for his treachery. First, Burns tried talking his way through the situation, but his voice was unheard by the screaming mob below. Then he offered them British gold from the treasury next door, but the mob knew well that the money was theirs for the taking regardless. And at last, as Rory Stewart's commentary put it,
of a city that he loved and thought the most beautiful in the world was not of gardens, not of poetry, but a last desperate sprint across his neighbours' roofs, hoping that he could find a way out. But the crowd was everywhere. He wrapped a turban around his head, dropped down, praying he wouldn't be recognised, and for a moment he wasn't. But then the cry went up. Sikander Burns, he was hacked down.
The moments that followed were almost farcical in nature. While the Afghans feared the British would strike back lethally and crush the rebellion, the British themselves were hiding from the mob. While some of the younger troops showed the hunger to fight, they were led by Elphinstone and Macnaghten, who were simply unwilling to do so. Macnaghten had already been promoted to Governor of Bombay, and he had no will to spend a second more in this wretched situation. And Elphinstone was old, sick, and weak. Both of these leaders wasted valuable seconds quarrelling and bickering over the best strategy to take. And this gap in time where the British could have taken control was lost. The Afghans soon had the upper hand, and the British were trapped in their cantonments, which were a terrible position to defend. However, Macnaghten had one last trick up his sleeve. He was going to try to game the system. At this point, the British were essentially walled in. The Afghans, psychologically boosted by the arrival of Dost Muhammad's son Akbar Khan, were in the driver's seat. But things were not quite as desperate as they seemed. For some of the Afghan tribal chiefs were not exactly loyal to Dost Muhammad, who ruled with an iron fist, and preferred the weaker Shah Shuja to stay on the throne. And Macnaghten took full advantage. He began sending emissaries to each of the individual chiefs, promising British gold and fortune, trying to turn each one against the other and against Akbar Khan. And on the 22nd November, he thought it worked. A messenger of Akbar's reached Macnaghten, allowing a truce where Shah Shuja stayed on the throne and the British stayed in Afghanistan till the spring. These terms were way better than what had been discussed before, and Macnaghten was delighted. The next day, Macnaghten set off to meet Akbar near the Kabul River, ready to sign off on these favourable terms. But he was in for a rude shock, for Akbar had met treachery with treachery. "Begir, seize," he cried, and his men descended on Macnaghten and dragged him behind a hill. Some say they hacked him to death. You see, Akbar Khan knew full well of Macnaghten's perfidy, and he had weaved a cunning trap. Macnaghten's double game had backfired terribly. Now the British were truly helpless. They quickly agreed a meek surrender and began their long, cold, and weary march to Jalalabad. And on the way, they met Afghan bullets. At Akbar's behest, the Afghans, sharpshooters with their jezzails, picked on the struggling British men like shooting fish in a barrel. Horrid scenes, too horrid to describe here, unfolded. In the end, only one man of the 16,000 men, women and children that left Kabul was able to reach the fort at Jalalabad. When the garrison saw him approaching, many prepared for hordes of British officers to arrive. None came. This rout was a huge shocker at home and cemented the name Afghanistan in British minds. This was exacerbated when Fiorentia Sale, one of the wives of the British officers, immortalized every last grisly detail of what had folded. Now the British public were acutely aware of the empire's doings in Central Asia and never wanted such a disaster to repeat. Eventually, desiring revenge, the British re-invaded Afghanistan. The army made its way to Kabul and raised the Union Jack, just to save face and provide some sort of closure for the humiliating defeat. But unlike last time, they knew full well to stay away from the Afghan people. They quickly left, but not before destroying the bazaar as a symbolic revenge. However, after the looting, some unruly troops did commit some unspeakable atrocities, such as destroying homes and applying torches to the shops. But after that, they went back to India with their tails between their legs. And who was selected as the new ruler of the Afghans? Ironically, it was Dost Muhammad himself. The British realized the folly of their ways and came to accept that the Emir was the only man capable of controlling Afghanistan properly. Just as how centuries later on, the United States would let their bitter enemies, the Taliban, rule the country. There simply was no other viable option. And so we reach half-time in the Great Game. For the next 10 years, the Tournament of Shadows would go silent. Both Britain and Russia tried to make peace and de-escalate the conflict. But soon enough, events in a completely different part of the world would make these countries bitter enemies again, and the Great Game would come back to the fore. But those events are for another video at another time. If you enjoyed this documentary, feel free to like it and subscribe to our channel. If not, leave a comment as to how we could improve. This video and the sequel that will follow would not have been possible without three main sources. Firstly, we heavily relied on two books, Peter Hopkirk's The Great Game and William Dalrymple's Return of a King, to construct the timeline and narrative of The Great Game and its beginnings. In addition, the documentary titled The Great Game by Rory Stewart gave further insight into the psyche, the mindset of the Afghan people, and their views. Without these sources, this video would simply not have been possible. Thank you very much for watching, and cheers.